tools. You can do a lot of that stuff by hand. Take a tip from me, though it may seem rudimentary. The simple strategies are sure to please. With dovetails, shingle nails, straight planes and awls, plumb bob, shaving horses, gouges and saws, hammers and mallets and augers and axes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. This is a request from a Patreon sponsor who wanted to see how I would cut mitered half laps by hand. It's an interesting joint. I mean, the half lap in general kind of gets lumped into the weaker family of joints. And frankly, any joint that I think can't be dry fit and stay together, like without clamps, probably is a little bit weaker than like one that's going to fit together snugly, hammer tight, and you don't need clamps to hold the whole thing together. But they certainly have their place. I have used the mitered half lap on the front of my cabinet doors here. It gives you that cool, clean, mitered look at the corners. But the reason I was kind of able to get away with that is this mitered frame and panel is then sat on top of a dovetailed clamshell carcass. So it kind of, any lacking of strength that it might have, because there's a fair amount of racking force when you hang a door off the edge like this. So backing it up really allowed me to get away with just using a standard half lap there. And of course I've got grooves in here and a floating panel in it. But there's a lot of different ways that you can use this. And really it's a half lap. It's not that much more complicated other than the fact that we are going to be cutting a 45-degree angle on certain parts of it. So let me switch over to the tight cam. And I'm going to be putting the joints on these ends. So I've got two pieces here that are the same width. They could really be whatever width you want. You'll find that it's just a lot easier when cutting miters when you've got the same width, and I'm going to join them together. The important part always, with really any joinery, but especially with the half lap, is you need to have reference faces marked, and I've used green lumber crayon to have it show out a little bit better on camera here. So I've got a reference edge and a reference face marked on both pieces. And that's the edge that I'm always going to be running the fence of my gauge up against. You can spend a fair amount of time setting the gauge to get it exactly in the halfway point of the thickness, but really I just set it by eye, because as long as I reference the fence of the gauge off the same reference face, and these reference faces, we'll look at them as this is the show face. Both of these go up when it's assembled. So as long as I'm marking from that same face, I'm going to get a joint that comes out flush. So let's just do that first. I'm going to lay one piece over top of the other, just kind of flush it up, and let's make sure that it's square. And with that, I'm going to take my knife and I've got a baseline. Now you could set a gauge off your width. As long as these ends have been shot and they're nice and square, you could run a gauge from the end the same way. I just find that this is the true test here. So let's do the same thing on this piece. You notice I'm checking for my reference edge and lining my square up to that reference edge. Get it nice and flush on the end. Now, I will probably want to I need to transfer the baseline around to the other side on one of these, so I need to kind of make a decision on which one's going to be the male part of the joint and which one's the female part of the joint. But for now, I've got a gauge set, and I just kind of eyeballed it to the middle of the board. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly the middle. just as long as I keep the gauge referenced against my reference face. Then over to this other piece, there's my reference face. Keep the fence against that face. And you can see I am not, well, maybe you can see, maybe you can't. I am not in the center. I eyeballed poorly being in the center, and that's not a big deal because it's the same measurement. So now that I've got that lap marked in, I need to decide which one is going to be the male part, which one's going to be the female. I'll make this one the male part of the joint. So what that means is I need to, let me darken in my gauge lines so that they show up a little bit better. So this one, I'm going to leave the top section because it's going to lap over there. So I need to remove the bottom. And I mean, with just about any joint, marking your waist is going to be important, but really, really important on the half lap, because if you mix these things up, well, that's a problem. So on the female part of the joint, I need to now put waist marks on the top. So now that I know which one I'm going to remove, I've got a baseline on this piece that I started with. Well, I don't need that because I'm going to end up leaving that there. I will use it for a layout, but eventually once this joint is assembled, I'll probably plane away that knife line. But what I do need to do is transfer this baseline around to the other side since I'm going to be cutting this material off. So I use a saddle square for that, just to allow me to wrap it around. I could just use a regular combo square, but this is exactly what saddle squares are designed for. Okay. And this, I've got the gauge. I'm going to be removing the top section, so let me just extend my knife lines down the sides. As usual, folks, anybody who has questions, feel free to pipe up, drop them in the chat room. I love it if you put them in all caps because it makes it easier for me to see. And I will make sure that I check in on that periodically. Hi, everybody. Happy early Thanksgiving. Okay, so now, essentially, I can go ahead and cut a half lap. I need to figure out, I know this is going to be the male section, so I do want to go ahead and mark the miter into this. Just, I don't need to actually cut it yet, but it's not a bad idea to at least put the mark in. So I've got a 45-degree miter gauge that I very recently built. There are also saddle squares for this. Now ideally, you know it's 45 because we already set the width. So when I line my knife line up with the baseline and I set the 45 up against it, it should exactly intersect the far corner because I've essentially created, you know, a square that way. So there is my miter, and I can finish the layout by saying this is the part that I'm going to remove. So I'm removing the underside all the way around, and I'm going to, once I've got that removed, I'll have this little lap here. I'll go ahead and cut that off there. I'm not going to worry about laying in the female part yet. I could go ahead and put the 45 on there, but kind of a little extra gut check is I cut this one first, lay it over top, and actually trace it. That way, if this angle ends up slightly off 45, I can line everything up at 90, trace the angle, scribe the angle, and I still end up with a resultant 90-degree angle. Just a fun little pro tip, if you will. So I'm going to set the female part aside and go ahead and cut the half flap just like I normally would. So let's get a little insurance here on the baseline. Chisel that in. Sawing out that baseline. Now I will saw the lap just like, like we're sawing a tenon here. Flip it around. I'm working in Spanish cedar today, so a little bit of smell-o-vision. It smells wonderful in here now. I always cut the shoulders of my tenons or my half laps because what it does is create a little buffer between the saw and the bottom of the joint, and it prevents you actually from overcutting it because that kerf is sitting there waiting for the saw to intersect it. So as you're sawing down on that third part of the cut, sometimes you wonder, am I all the way through? You know when you're all the way through because the tenon teeth just falls away. So now I've got a half lap. Plain old ordinary, normal half lap. What I need to do now is actually saw the miter on this. So how do I want to position this? Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it like that. I suppose I don't really need the hold fast, but miters get a little slippy here. You could use a knife and put a knife line in here, but since I'm just going to use the angle that I saw here to scribe its mate, it actually isn't super important. So now I have first half of the joint done. So normal half lap, but the lap part is now 45. And just for fun, let's check it. That looks pretty dang 45 to me. All right. I didn't check that square. Yeah, that's nice and square too. So now I could come back here and, again, use my gauge line to draw all this in. But what I need to do is lay this over top. Make sure we're nice and flush. And just pinching that in place, I can now scribe that line. Oh, you know what? I do want to double check that I actually made this cut square. Okay, we're square. If this wasn't square, if you needed to do any trimming or cleanup here, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to do a quick pass with a block plane just to clean it up. I mean, it's a pretty clean surface already. But obviously, the less fuzz that I have there, the tighter that joint's going to be. So now I come back and transfer. And honestly, I mean, I removed like zero material from that. I just kind of cleaned up the saw mark. So my knife line falls really in the same place. So now, let me switch back to the tight shot here. Jean-Luc has got a question about what situations do you prefer this joint over something else. Honestly, purely aesthetics. You know, and it's one of the reasons we choose mitered joints in general, because we get that clean, consistent grain all the way through. The same reason that I chose it for the doors on my cabinet. I love the wrapping grain look of the cherry as it comes around. It really makes a different appearance than traditional, you know, frame and panel mortise and tenons. You know, if you needed, and also I will say that this is a frame and panel, so this mahogany floats in a groove, and the miters allow you to hide that groove. You know, normally that groove would be filled in, or you'd have to do a haunch tenon or something like that. In this case, the groove certainly came out the end, but once I mitered it together, it doesn't matter. So it's a stylistic thing. Honestly, you know, if you think a half lap, you know, half lap is going to be weaker than a mortise and tenon because just the fact that it doesn't hold together, but there's still a fair amount of glue surface. On this joint, it's actually weaker than a normal half lap. You know, here would be my size of my glue surface, and now I've just got half of that, you know? So I'm actually lessening the glue surface, but you could also make a case for saying, because I've got this mitered wall here, I'm actually creating another 90-degree intersection to butt up against. So it does maybe hold together anti-rack a little bit better than a traditional mitered lap, but honestly, the whole reason I choose this is for aesthetic purposes. So I'm going to now take out the waste here, and I've got my lines, you know, because I marked the half lap originally, I can see that I'm removing material from the top, but now that I've got the miter line in, I want to leave this section. So I'm very, very clearly putting in my, my marks here. Now on this one, I saw the baseline first, then I saw the cheat cut. I'm going to do the same thing here, but now my baseline is the 45 degree. And because we are wanting to match this angle as closely as we can, now is a good time to use a chisel and use that, you know, added accuracy that comes from putting that little wall there. And I can just go ahead and saw it here too. So again, this is exactly the same as what we just did. We just happen to be sawing the baseline at an angle. Although technically, 90 degrees is an angle. I think I need to go a little bit deeper out at the tip of that miter. Yeah. So now, the baseline's cut. We put it back in the vise. Just darkening in my lines so that I can see them a little better. It's one thing about filming in the shop is the camera lighting isn't always the best woodworking lighting. Okay, now in this case, we stop at that corner because of this miter. I mean, I can go a little bit past the corner. It's not going to be the end of the world. But I essentially make this in one cut now, and I need to lower this down a little so I can get the angle right. So I'm essentially putting that 45-degree baseline kind of parallel to my bench top. It allows me to get a better feel for sawing to that, and the cheek comes away. Again, number one reason why I saw along the baseline first. Voila. So there's the converse. The two of them come together. It's pretty clean. I think, well, let's do the real test. Is this, when I drive this shoulder tight up against that one, I am 90 degrees. I do think I've got a little bit of extra material here at the butt end of the miter that I can just see there's a tiny bit of a gap out of the toe because I'm pushing a little bit away here. So let's clean that up. And actually, this is going to be a rare treat, folks. I hope everyone's excited. I could do this with a chisel, but this is really one of the only reasons that I still have a shoulder plane lying around. I rarely use them, but I have this little 1/4-inch Veritas plane, and it's a perfect opportunity to clean up that inside corner. Yeah, I can actually see a little bit of my knife line right here on the edge. I'm a little fat right there. And maybe one more pass. And that did it. So now it comes up tight all the way along that line, and we have a mitered half flat. That's how that works. So, I mean, it's exactly a half flat. We just have 45 degrees on the baseline on this one. The male part of this joint, as I said, is cut exactly the same as a normal lap. We just, then go ahead and take that one extra step and cut that into place. So interesting joint. It's a fun joint to play with. The important parts in keeping the whole thing square is getting that 90-degree baseline, that first cut I made. Get that one spot on, and that will give you that hard shoulder that you're pressing it up against that will keep the whole thing running 90 degrees, which, of course, if you're making a frame like we did, on these doors, that's going to be the important part. So, that being said, we'll take a quick commercial break. It is everyone who has an email inbox has an inbox stuffed full of Black Friday offers right now. So, I figured I'd get ahead of the game. Anybody who's followed me long enough knows that I do one sale a year at the Hand Tool School, and it is a Black Friday sale. So here we are the day before Thanksgiving. I figured I'd get a head start since that seems to be the trend this year. But it's been an odd year. I had to end up taking kind of the summer off because I did a whole bunch of woodworking guild presentations, and I just didn't have the actual manpower, hours in the day to continue doing live streams and stuff like that on the YouTube channel, because I did 27 guild presentations this summer. So it's kind of like, I felt like, especially folks who sponsored the show, folks who show up for these live streams, it's like I feel like I let you guys down. So I'm doing a big discount this year, 40%. It's the largest discount I've ever done. This is certainly anybody who watches this is going to get that code that's on there, but it's good only until midnight Thanksgiving night. It's just a short-term thing with the idea that, you know, the folks who tune into the show, who support the show, kind of get that little deal. So I do appreciate it. I am thankful for the people who bother to show up in these live streams and ask questions, the people who give me the topic ideas. You know, I could pull topics out of the air, but I would much rather do stuff that, you know, resonates with whatever it is you're working on at the moment. So this just happened to be something that came up, and I love doing joinery demonstrations. So yeah, that's my my spiel, my pitch, my Black Friday sale going on. As I said, that code gets you 40% off everything, and it runs. It is effective through midnight, or I should say through Thanksgiving Day. There is a normal holiday sale that kicks in after that, but it's not going to be saving quite as much. So there's my sales pitch. It's crazy how long I've been doing this, and sales pitch still makes me uncomfortable. I feel like I got to get through it as fast as possible. So let's talk questions. I didn't think that was going to take a terribly long time. So other questions about this joint, other questions about variations on this joint or what. It was interesting. I'd be curious from the chat room, has anybody used this and why? Why did you choose it? You know, my answer earlier was purely for aesthetics. I can't think of a compelling reason that I would want to make this joint over something else. So I'd be really curious for those that have used it. I do think that it was particularly effective in this setting, but really that's why we use miters anyway, right? Is that continuous grain wrap. So if anybody's used it, I'd love to know why or how. That'd be kind of cool. Yeah. Let's see. Any recommendations on a material to make templates out of with hand tools? Well, templates for what? Like templates for furniture? Templates like what I got in the back of the shop here? Let's just bring the whole thing. Here's my story stick and template pile. Some of you might remember the Wood Whisperer Guild Woodworkers Fighting Cancer children's table set. There's a template for that. Here's a template for a Limbert 244 table. I built that in the hand tool school, I don't know, 10 years ago. Here is a template / story stick for a 4-poster bed. Adirondack footstool. Here's a template for a headboard on a bed. I made that dock chair last summer. Here's the templates for those 2 legs. So yeah, if that's what we're talking about, then I think, frankly, you can do a lot of different stuff. I mean, some of it depends on how you're going to use the template. If you're using power tools with a template, you know, like pattern routing bits and things like that, you really need to have a thicker template material for that bearing to ride against. In my case, in the hand tool shop, I'm using them literally just to trace around, just to give me a line to work to, so they don't have to be particularly thick. This Limbert template is probably about the thickest I work with, and it's 1/4 inch MDF. And there's no particular reason why I chose a thicker material for this particular piece. Just kind of, it's what probably I had on hand at the time. But what I usually use is something like this. This is like 1/8 inch. It's actually metric. It's less than an 1/8 inch, but it's really thin plywood. And what this stuff is generally when when a bunk of plywood is brought in, the whole thing is wrapped in this thin stuff to protect the plies inside from forklift damage and things like that. They sheathe the whole thing in this thinner material. And they will often put it in between bolsters and things like that to protect the plywood faces. They'll put it on the top and the bottom. It's just meant to protect the plywood. So if you go to a place where they sell plywood, ask them what they do with the stuff that the plywood's wrapped in when it comes in, and they guarantee you they'll tell you, we throw it out. So if you can go to them and say, look, I'd love to have it, and they'll say, well, it's all broken up and things like that, and it usually is. You know, it comes in big, long, imagine a bunk of plywood, 4x8 sheets stacked 36 to 48 inches high. So you've got a 4x8 sheet of this on the top, usually 2 or 3 of them, stacked on top of one another. And then you've got 48-inch wide sheets running around wrapping the whole thing. And they get beat to hell. So they often are splintered and broken into pieces, and you end up with stuff like this. If you can get your hands on it, this stuff is fantastic template material. First of all, it's plywood. I mean, it is actually plywood. There are 3 plies in this. Usually it's some sort of low-end Luan type plywood, but it remains stable. It's thin enough. I mean, you may find that it potato chips on you a little bit, but not too much. And it's so thin that if like your pattern cups a little, it's thin enough that you can press it down flat and hold it while you trace around it. But because it is plywood, it's not really going to expand and contract that much on you. But what I also find is when we're doing pattern work, generally there's curves, right? We don't really use patterns unless they're curves. They're straight lines, we tend to use a story stick. So with curves comes, at least with hand tools, comes things like turning saws and rasps and spoke shaves and curve cutting tools. And you lay out your pattern, and then you've got to use those tools in order to shape your project piece. Well, you can create the pattern and use those same tools to refine the pattern back to the shape you want, and it kind of acts like a warm-up. Or if you've never done curve or linear work before with hand tools, actually making the pattern can be a great warm-up practice. And because this stuff is really thin, it's actually fantastic spoke shave practice. You can really, really easily shape one of these very quickly with a finely set spoke shave. In this instance, you can see I actually had a pattern that was sprayed here to the front, and I worked back to it. Most of the time, if I'm develop my own patterns, I spend a lot of time kind of sketching on the sheet and refining exactly the way I want the pattern to be. And then, I will grab my turning saw, which is hiding behind my Chevrolet over here. Grab my turning saw, saw the thing out as close to the line as I dare, and then grab a spoke shave to refine it right back to the line, or it can be a great opportunity to reach in and grab a rasp and a file to get it exactly the way you want it. And you find once you've actually got the pattern, you've had a fair bit of experience with the actual shaping tools that you're now going to go use on your project piece itself. So certainly 1/4 inch MDF works fine, but you also find that that little extra thickness makes you just work that much harder. So I really like the really thin plywood, and I get it, for free all the time. Worst comes to worst, go to like a Home Depot or something, and they have those smaller sheets, like 2x2 and 2x4 sheets of plywood that usually I think the thinnest they have is 3/16, which I believe is what this material is made out of. This is a pattern for a corner cabinet. It's actually more of a story stick, but this is like Home Depot 3/16 ply. Here's a turning pattern for a pedestal table. Again, same situation. It's Home Depot plywood. I just tend to like the plywood more than anything else, but MDF finds its way in for various other small patterns when I need them. I just kind of went off on that. I'm hoping that's exactly what you were talking about. Go hang this stuff back up. It's like my personal goal of a successful wood shop. When you walk in and there are lots of patterns hanging on the wall, Ever since the very first time I went to Chuck Bender's shop, and he's got like a room filled with patterns. Gene Landon was the same way, just patterns everywhere. Especially in like 18th century furniture, like every single piece needs 3 or 4 different patterns. And it's just kind of so cool to go through and look through all the patterns. And it's like, you know, the history of that wood shop just in a snapshot, kind of neat. So yeah, I try to do my best to keep my patterns, even though I may never end up using them again. Any other questions? And thank you, Whitty's Workshop. He just told me that I'm not letting anyone down by doing a sales pitch. I appreciate that. Yeah, I work in marketing, but I'm terrible at it when it comes to marketing my own stuff. By the way, guys, we did this in the hand tool school recently. If you haven't built your own square yet, do it. It's such a fun, like, quick hour-long project to do. It's well worth the time. In fact, a couple years ago, we built a really fancy square. That's this one, and we used a wedged mortise and tenon and a sliding dovetailed joint. It's a combo joint, and then inlaid into the top a peg. You know, this certainly took more than an hour. I think I broke this up over like 3 different videos, but I love using this thing. But it's funny how simple this little oak and teak pegged thing, how simple it was to make, but just how much I grab for it now. Yeah, I've got fine Starrett squares sitting here in my cabinet, and you saw I did this entire project using scrap wood from my own shop. I'm just gonna throw that back up there. Yeah, right, Sharif? You guys got to see a shoulder plane in use in this shop. I have blog posts and videos specifically saying shoulder planes are stupid. But I have one, and that's why I have one. There will be times when, like, I mean, I don't care how good of a sawyer you are, someday you're gonna screw up. And when that happens, it's generally a tenon shoulder, which is why I have a shoulder plane. It's not, you know, a 1-inch shoulder plane or a 1/2 inch. It's just a little 1/4 inch, and that's exactly what it's used for. And honestly, I can't remember the last time I sharpened this blade because I use it so rarely that the blade is still super sharp. But yeah, they have their place. I just don't rarely use them. All right, that overlay graphic is just kind of annoying me. It's too much. Any other questions? I can certainly call this a night and go an afternoon and go for a bike ride on this sunny day. But I plan to be here an hour if you guys have the questions to fill it. 2 shoulder planes? No. Well, I mean, I have a small rabbit plane, but no. I used to, yes. I used to have a Lee Nielsen and a larger Veritas, and I ended up selling both of those. They just wasn't using them. No reason to have them in my shop. Other side of this half lap joint is a crazy compound bridle joint, multi-angled compound bridle joint. This is the random scrap that I have in my shop. It's already got some joint cut on the other side of it. I figured I might as well just go ahead and use it again. Okay, I'm trying to understand what Enrico's asking here. He reported the line. Well, he put the 2 pieces at 90, so it doesn't matter the angle. Yes. Yes. So in the past, I've cut this just, you know, using my miter square or, you know, combo square or something like that to scribe the 45. But when you mark the joint on when you mark both sides of the joint using a square, you absolutely have to be 45 degrees. But if you mark and cut the first joint and then scribe it, just like dovetails, it does not matter what those, if you cut them tails first, it does not matter what those tails look like, because you're going to describe the exact shape of the tails onto the pin board. And then you cut the pin board to the line. So dovetails, you can fall asleep at the saw for the first half of the joint. It's the second half that you got to get your sawing right, because now you have to meet that line. So when I sawed this miter on the male part, I just went at it. I just went to the line and sawed. When I sawed this line, you saw I went in with a chisel and I created that little knife wall because I wanted that little bit of extra precision to make sure that I nailed that line. Is this 45 degrees? This square has been tested, by the way, at 45 degrees. And I'd say yes. I would say yes, that is 45 degrees. So it does so happen that we got 45 degrees because this line was 45 and it comes together neatly. But if this were, it could be a 60-degree angle, it could be a 30-degree angle. The problem with that, if you start changing the angle, is you start to lose the aesthetic appeal. The beauty of the 45 is we are bisecting the 90-degree angle. So we get the grain, coming up. It's kind of hard to hold this together. This is what I mean by joints that don't hold themselves together without clamps. They're bound to be weaker. But that grain wrapping effect coming right up to the mitered point is the aesthetic appeal of this joint. If we did it at 60 degrees or 30 degrees, if I bumped it down to 30 degrees, you would see I'd have ingrained. This line over here would be fatter, and I would have a little bit of ingrain visible on the end instead of this cleaner look where the grain wraps all the way around. Now, that actually might end up looking kind of cool. Because you've got ingrain here anyway. But that's the thing. Once you change the angle, you lose a little bit of that aesthetic appeal of the miter. What makes that wrapping grain look so cool, like we have in these doors, is that those are 45 degrees. The other thing is once you start tweaking the angles, you remember this is a joint in abstract. Once you put it together into a frame, you've got four corners. And if it starts to get a lot more confusing if the angles are not right. The important part is the resultant angle. When the joint goes together and this shoulder runs up tight, it's important that I now have a resultant 90 degrees. 45 and 45 gives you 90. I don't think I need to say that, did I? I think everyone knows that. How do you true up the inside corner of a wooden square? With a chisel. Chisel on a block plane. So you have to identify where it's out of square first. You do the whole square test technique, which I just so happen to use. Oops, I moved my camera. I also use the same template plywood that we were just talking about for that. But for the purposes of this, I'll just use my bench hook. I line it up, mark a line, flip it end for end, and then mark the line again. And I can barely see that, so I know you guys can't see it. But you want to look, are those lines parallel? Or if you mark right on top of the line, do the lines match? If they don't, it's out of square. So say the line is like that and like that. So it's wider at the far end and closer together. Well, that tells me that I have the square is leaning down this way. It's diving down. So I've got material to remove out at the tip of the square on the underside. By the way, the same thing works on the outside. It's just you've got full access at this point. If it's leaning down, well, I can actually get to the tip pretty easily, and I can grab something like a block plane, and by skewing it, I can actually reach almost the entire inside of that blade just by skewing that plane, and I can remove that. If the line skewed out like that, so the lines are wider at the bottom than they are at the top, then the square is angled up. I've got too much material down here, and that's where things get a little bit hairy. I can still use my block plane and at a heavy skew, I can remove material about 3/8 of an inch from the handle by skewing it like that. I can do a fair amount of removal. So what I do is try to remove as much as that with the block plane, and then I would obviously clamp this, but then I can turn around and I can reference the flat of the chisel off the surface of this and just pare right back into the inside corner to remove that. Ultimately, when you're building a square, the idea is to cut the bridle joint as square as you possibly can, so that when it goes together, if it's not dead on square, it's so dang close that truing it up is a couple of passes with a plane in order to fix it. But yeah, the inside, mostly done with the chisel. Or if you really want, and you know that it's going to end up slightly out of square, do your best to angle it down, so that all you have to do is move material out at the tip of the blade rather than on the inside. Although I don't find either operation harder than the other. It's the same principle of removing the material where there's excess. Other questions? Hey, Whitty, I fall asleep at the saw a lot. I find sawing very meditative, so a lot of times I get a lot of thinking done, and then if I think too much, I fall asleep at the saw. We all make stupid cuts, you know? You make that wonky cut that just doesn't line up, and you're trying to figure out what the heck did I do? It's because you just fell asleep at the saw. Good sawing requires focus. Are we asking questions about my tendon saw? My favorite saw? I love this thing. I've had this for 11 years. It's a lovely, lovely saw. It cuts super fast. And frankly, the secret to cutting accurate tendons is to do it efficiently. Because the more time you spend trying to cut that, the more chance you can screw it up. So if you've got an aggressively pitched saw with a deep plate, so you can cut really deep joints, you're going to be very happy with it. I have a 16-inch tendon saw that I rarely use because the 18-inch it does all my jobs. Okay, well, then I think we will wrap this up, and I will say thanks to everybody for coming out. I love joinery demonstrations, so anytime you guys have a particular joint in mind, I'm happy to do it. I've done this in the hand tool school where I've kind of thrown down the gauntlet and said, send me your weird joints, and we cut those. And I've done several crazy three-way miters and three-way mitered half laps. Those are fun. I've got a Japanese temple scarf joint over on the wall that I've done. They're a lot of fun. So yeah, for the future, if you have joinery you want me to try out, I'm happy to do it. So with that, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Take advantage of the sale, and I will say goodbye.